The Settlers of Catan, how to set up and play. First thing you'll do is take all of the 19 land hexes, shuffle them completely, and put them into this random hex pattern. 5 in the middle row, then 4, then 3 on the outside. Next you'll shuffle the distribution tokens and randomly place them on the land hexes. Just make sure that there are no two red distribution tokens touching each other. And the only land hex that doesn't get a token is the desert. You'll put the robber token there. Next, you shuffle all of your seaport hexes, and you're going to start here in the middle and then place them around the game board, alternating a blank sea tile and then a seaport. Just make sure that the seaport is facing towards the longest section of land hexes. So this one would face this way, where there's 4 hexes, versus facing this way, where there's only 3 land hexes. Next, you'll separate and put out all of the resource cards. You have brick, grain, ore, wool, and lumber. The land hexes on the board correspond to the resource type. So the hills produce brick, the fields produce grain, the mountains produce the ore, the meadows produce the wool, and the forests produce the lumber. Next, you'll shuffle all of the development cards and create a face-down deck on the table. Then set aside the dice along with the tiles for the longest road and largest army, and then give all players their starting player pieces. All players will get a building cost aid along with their starting tokens. They're going to get 5 settlements or towns, 4 cities, and 15 roads. The next part of setup is for each player to put their starting settlements on the game board. So have all players roll the dice. The highest roll will be the start player, and then we'll proceed clockwise. So starting with the first player, each player is now going to place their first settlement. Settlements go on the intersections or the corners of the hexes. They're also going to place an adjoining road to the settlement. Roads go on the hex edges. After the first player has placed their first town and road, the next player in clockwise order will place theirs. An important rule is that the settlements can never be adjacent to another settlement. It has to be at least 2 corners away from a settlement. So while they couldn't place there, they could place there. And then they're also going to place their adjoining road. So we're going to continue around the table until all players have placed their first settlement. After all players have placed their first settlement, all players will now get a chance to place a second settlement. But here we go in reverse order. So since red was the last player to place, they're going to be the first player to place their second settlement. And it doesn't need to be adjacent to the first one they picked. So let's say they pick there. Again, they're going to put an adjoining road. When players place their second starting settlement, they're going to collect resources from all hexes that the settlement touches. So this red player is going to get 2 wool cards and a brick card from the supply. So snaking back to the start player, they'll be the final one to place their second settlement. For the second settlement, you collect the resource cards. The desert does not produce any resources, so they'll just get a lumber and an ore card. The sea hexes also do not produce any resources. And then don't forget to put your adjoining road. We're now ready to start the game with the first player. On a player's turn, the first thing they'll do is roll the dice. Let's say this player rolls a 6. That's going to indicate which land hexes produce for all players. So we look at the land hexes that have the 6 here and here. Any player with a settlement or a city adjacent to that hex are going to receive resource cards. So here the blue player's going to get a grain card for that 6 tile. And then for this one, both the white and the green player are going to get a wool card. It's also important to remember that each settlement on the adjacent hex is going to produce 1 resource card. If players have a city on the hex, each city is going to produce 2 cards of the rolled hex. The other thing that can happen when rolling dice is if a 7 gets rolled. You'll notice there is not a 7 distribution token. So if a 7 gets rolled, no hexes are going to produce. Instead, the active player is going to get to activate the robber. But the first thing that happens whenever a 7 gets rolled, Any player, including the active player, that has more than 7 resource cards has to discard half their cards rounded down. Next, the active player that just rolled the 7 must move the robber to another land hex. The robber can never go back to the desert, nor can the robber be placed on a sea hex. The robber has to be moved to another land hex. So let's say the player selects this one. You place it on the distribution token, meaning that this hex cannot produce when that number is rolled until that robber is moved away from the hex. Finally, the player that moved the robber gets to steal a resource card from a player adjacent to the hex where they move the robber. So here they have a choice. They can take a random card from the green player or the blue player. Just draw randomly one card from the selected player. After the dice roll has been resolved, the active player can now trade resource cards. And it's only the active player that can initiate trades with other players. If trading with other players, they can trade any amount of cards. So you can trade 3 for 1 or equal number of cards. You just cannot trade like resources, nor can you simply gift cards. Some exchange has to happen. And keep in mind, we're only trading resource cards. You're never allowed to trade development cards. In addition to trading with other players, the active player can also trade with the bank. It would take 4 cards of the same type. Those would get returned to the supply, and the player would get 1 resource card of their choice. The active player can also trade with the seaport tiles if they have a settlement or a city on one of these spots. So let's say the active player had a city or a town there. They could trade, instead of the generic 4-to-1 ratio with the bank, here they could trade 3 of one type for 1 of their choice. There are also ports that accept a specific type of resource. So on the red player's turn, since they have a settlement adjacent to this port, they could trade 2 brick cards for 1 card of their choice. The final portion of a player's turn is they can build as much as desired or as much as can be afforded. These are the different types of things that can be built in the game. Let's first cover settlement. So to build a settlement, the player would have to turn back into the supply 1 lumber card, a brick card, a grain card, and a wool card. And then they would take, as long as they have an available token, a settlement, and it follows the normal rules. So this settlement could not be adjacent. Since this settlement is 1 corner away, it would have to be at least 2 corners away from any settlement. Also, the settlement could not just be placed anywhere on the game board. It would have to connect to the existing infrastructure of the player. So it would have to be built off an extended road system. The other type of structure a player can build is a city. It's going to take 2 grain cards and 3 ore cards. The important thing to remember about cities is that they have to replace an existing settlement. So let's say this player turns in their 5 cards to the bank. They would select one of their existing settlement tokens and then replace it with a city. And then this settlement token would now get returned to their personal supply, possible for reuse. And we'll remember, cities, in addition to giving more victory points at the end of the game, produce 2 resource cards whenever a hex produces. Another item a player can build are roads. Each road is going to cost 1 wood and 1 brick card. You would take the road piece from your supply and extend your road network. So the player may decide to place there on that empty edge, or they could extend here, or let's say they decide to extend the road there. One of the bonuses in the game goes to the player that currently has the longest road. The first player to play an unbroken road of at least 5 segments would get this tile or card. But you'll notice it can change hands throughout the game. So whenever a player built a longer road, they would take possession of this tile. So the player on this turn, they built that road segment, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's a continuous unbroken road. They would immediately take this into their possession, and now it increases their victory point total by 2. Keep in mind, it has to be a continuous unbroken road. As long as their settlements are there, that's okay, but another player could not have a settlement here. That would break the road. Also, it's a continuous road. you don't count any side segments. So if a player built another road there, that would not add an extra segment. It's just a continuous road. The longest road bonus will stay in the possession of this player until another player exceeds the number of segments that they have in the longest road. So let's say in this example, we know they have 5. If the blue player extended their road system by coming here, that would give them 5. So even though there's a tie, this player has not been exceeded. So they hold on to the tile. Now, if this blue player also built that road, that would give them 6 segments exceeding their longest road of 5. So the blue player would immediately take possession of that card. One final important point, we've talked about the road has to be continuous and unbroken. What if the red player on a future turn decided to build a settlement right there? That's legal. It's an open corner that connects to their road system. That would break this blue player's road. So now their longest segment is only 1, 2, 3, 4, so they no longer have the longest road. So they would have to give up the tile to the player that had the longest road at that point. So it would come back to the white player with 5. If a road gets broken like that, and there is no single player with the longest road, let's say multiple players are tied for it, this just goes back into the display until a player has the longest road all by themselves. The final type of item you can build on your turn is a development card. So it would take 1 grain, 1 wool, and 1 ore, turn those into the bank, and you immediately get to draw a development card off the top of the deck. Next, let's cover development cards. Players are allowed to play 1 development card per turn. They can play the development card at any time during their turn, even before they roll the dice. It's just important to remember that you're not allowed to play a development card that was built during that turn. The only exception are the development cards that give you victory points. When a victory point card is acquired that's simply kept face down and kept secret, they can all be revealed at the same time when a player is trying to claim victory. Even a victory point card that was just drawn during that turn can get revealed. So here are the 5 different types of development cards in the game. The first type are the victory points that we talked about. Then there's the Monopoly card. So if you played this, you would announce 1 resource type, and then all players would have to give you all of their resources of that type. So let's say the player plays this card on their turn, they announce brick, all players must give you all of their brick cards. Next is the road building card. The player would get to place 2 roads immediately without having to pay any of the resource costs. Follow the normal rules. Next is the invention card. The player would get to immediately take 2 resources from the supply. And finally is the night card. So when playing the night card, the player would get to move the robber, and then they would get to steal 1 resource card from the owner of an adjacent settlement or city. So let's say it was the green player's turn, and before they rolled the dice, they wanted to make sure that this hex had a chance to produce. So they play a night card. The night card would go in front of them. They would now move the robber, following the normal rules, so it has to go to another land hex. So let's say they select this one, preventing this from producing, and then they could select either the blue player or the red player. Since they're both adjacent, they would select one of those players and randomly steal 1 card from their hand. So whenever you play the Monopoly, the road building, or the invention development card, that would simply get discarded. Victory points stay secretly face down until you're ready to reveal all of them. Whenever you play a night card, it's going to stay face up in front of the player, because there's another bonus called the largest army, and the first player to play 3 or more night cards gets this bonus. Again, it can exchange hands whenever another player exceeds the number of knights played in front of them. After a player completes their turn, we simply go clockwise to the next player so they can take their turn by rolling the dice, performing trades, building items, playing a development card. Play will continue until one player on their turn is the first to accumulate 10 total victory points. This tile shows a reminder of where victory points come from. Victory points can come from settlements, so each settlement on the game board for a player is worth 1 victory point. Each of their cities on the game board is worth 2 victory points. You'll remember by building roads, it may have earned you the longest road tile, which is worth 2 victory points if it's in your possession. Development cards may give you victory points that can be revealed. They also help you play knights that can give you the largest, that should say army, that's also worth 2 victory points. So the first player that gets 10 victory points on their turn is the winner of the game. Before we end, I just wanted to mention the rules for the 5 or 6 player expansion. First, you'll use a larger hex map. So instead of using 19 tiles, you'll use 30 land tiles. You'll have 6 in the middle, then 5, 4, and 3 on the outside. The only other rule change in a 5 or 6 player game is at the end of each player's turn, there's a special building phase. So each subsequent player, in clockwise order, may perform as many build actions as they can afford or would desire. They're not allowed to trade, they're not allowed to play development cards, they're not allowed to claim victory, but they can perform build actions. What this does is help prevent resource discarding when a robber roll happens, because there's more space and more time in between turns to accumulate resources. And that should be everything you need to set up and play the Settlers of Catan.